بسم الله والحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله المبعوث رحمة للعالمين. We wanted briefly to address three issues that are important with regard to our ability to move forward as a community. One of the issues that we hear a lot is the constant, the repetitive blaming of imams for everything that happens in the community, and the blaming of imams for a lack of leadership in the community without a real address of exactly what is the case. And what is the case is that for the last 25 years, we've seen a system develop among the Muslims, and it developed parallel while transcending the model of Imam that existed here. There was a model of imamship that existed specifically in the indigenous community, in the African American Sunni community. That was the majority indigenous group. And in that community, what existed was the idea of the Imam not only as being a face of the community, not only being the motivator of the community by way of Juma and so on and so forth, but the Imam was the actual leader of the community in many senses. That model was displaced. Still exists, but it was displaced. And what we began to see, even when you go back and you look at, I always like to reference the study that, the masjid study that was done by Dr. Hassan Bagby. He did two studies, and in the first study, he talked about the different types of leadership styles that exist in the Muslim community. And then in the second study, there's a follow-up on where the community is at. But the first study, I find it to be pivotal. Although some people had criticized it, it was pioneering, and it was very insightful, because what you begin to see is that with the development of masajid that are board-centered, wherein the board becomes the leadership of the masjid on every front, even they dictate to the Imam, you begin to see more and more problems arise among the general community with regard to Islamic identity, with regard to practice. You even begin to see other issues like atheism and so on and so forth. I'm not saying there's a direct correlation, but what I'm saying is that you can use the model to understand that something is going on in the community. And one of the things that is going on over this time period of a couple decades or so is that there is no real Islamic leadership from the angle of Islamic knowledge, from the angle of developing the community in terms of knowledge and practice, right? And so in order for that to take place, not only do you have to have the evolution and the development of imams themselves to continue to take place, which most communities are hostile to that. There's no professional development that is really allowed in most communities. For an imam to leave his position for a year or 2 years and go on sabbatical and come back to a job, or for an imam to be given lighter duty so that he can develop himself, continue to develop himself further. That idea exists among Catholics. It exists amongst the people of the book. Unfortunately, among Muslims in the U.S., it does not exist. The imam is expected to be the perfect imam. And that's why you find the problem of hiring comes up, because the imam, they want the imam to be a counselor, they want the imam to be a master in tajweed, they want the imam to be a hafiz of the Quran, they want the imam to deliver the khutbah, they want the imam to do interfaith, they want the imam to deal with the youth or be a youth director, and so on and so forth. And there's a ton of expectations on the imam, and that particular community that is looking for that type of imam didn't do anything to build that imam, right? They didn't pretty much contribute towards a general fund so that that imam can get that education. They want somebody to come in with all of these qualifications, and then they want that person to work in a way that that person is not only fully, but almost totally committed to the community, to the absence of personal and family life, right? And so I've mentioned this on a number of different platforms, and I mentioned it again. So then the question comes up at the end of the day, really, bottom line is this: who is the leader, or what is leadership, or where does the leadership reside in the Muslim community? Because for the most part, as people blame the imams live a very precarious life. And I'm not victimizing the imams at all, but it's a reality. They live precarious lives. A board member or community member can complain and the imam can disappear. People try to bring out examples of imams that are publicly morally deficient, but that is not a norm. You understand what I'm saying? What ends up being the case is that the imam is actually cornered. The imam can't really gain a lot of influence in the community because the professional community, the professionals are the ones that have taken over the community, and they don't want to lead the community in reality, but they want to make decisions for the community. And this model, and I'm going to be critical here, this model was brought to us in part by the Islamic movement, in addition to others that were professionals, maybe not necessarily part of the Islamic movement. And it was a model wherein the professionals, the board, dominates the masjid. But again, does the chair of the board, is he the leader of the community? In reality, what we understand as leadership, he's not the leader of the community, but neither is the imam. So the chair of the board will sit on the board, and so the Muslim professionals, they consider that more important. The power behind the seat, so to speak. They consider that to be on the board more important than to have an actual leader. And there's many instances where board members, they have the understanding that they have, or they possess, more insight than the imam. They consider the imam not necessarily too bright of a person. The Desi community has its version of it, and the Arab community has its version of it. And even the African American community has its version of it. There was a video that went into circulation of late because of discussions that have been going on online, but it's an old video wherein Imam Waradin is criticizing the imams and saying these dumb imams, right? And you find community members have said that about imams as well. Whether it's justified or not, at this point, it's not the point, or at this juncture, it's not the point to really consider that. The issue that we're attempting to address right now is the absence of leadership. And so when people come and blame the imams, they have to realize that they may not understand the whole picture. You have in this country imams that are educated in ways that imams in other countries are not educated. You have imams with degrees in other areas outside of the sciences of the Quran and the Sunnah and experience in other fields. And so, part of the dilemma that you encounter here is even the position of Imam itself is not developed. So here in years, decades at this point of observation, I'm putting it at about a generation from my part, about 25 years of observation. And I'm observing this point from having come from a Catholic background, having come from studying to be a Catholic priest for a short period of time, seeing the leadership there, doing leadership stuff. As far as training and education and trying to gain experiences, the way that the professional community runs the masjid, it's not what they experience in the workplace. That's the reality. The way that the professionals run our institutions is not what they experience in their workplaces. Okay? So imams experience a lot of instability, a lot of humiliation, and their word is seldom listened to or seldom heard. Right? And some imams, they play along with that part, right? Not all imams have leadership qualities. Some imams just perform a service. But I wanted to speak to the issue that there are imams that have leadership qualities, and they still can't play the leadership role because the professional community controls the board, but the blame from the community on the whole for the state of the Muslim community goes back to the imam. That's a serious issue. The models that are in place are not models in which we have real leadership, because the board itself, to be unbiased as much as possible. Let's put this out there. If the board did its job, and if it really played the leadership role, and the chair of the board really took on the leadership of the masjid, even if we had a weak imam, we would have leadership. We would have leadership because you have the chair of the board would take on that responsibility of leading the community. Right? Actually leading the community, not performative leadership. Right? So part of what we need to address is actually what is leadership. And I've mentioned this throughout the years, I'll mention it again, imams do need to continue to develop themselves. But they need to be given the opportunity to develop themselves, and they need to be given the opportunity to exercise leadership so that they can continue to grow. There's no religious community that operates in this way, wherein the religious leaders within religious institutions really have no power, really have no decision making. And again, you give opportunities. You could create an institution wherein there is shared power. Yes, it has its own problems, but the more that people get to exercise their skill sets and their responsibilities, and the more that people get to understand what leadership is all about, then the better they become, right? If they're under the right conditions of growth and so on and so forth. And so a lot of what we see, is coming back to this problem that the leadership is neither with the imam or the board, right? And so that's a crisis. The other thing that comes up is that when it comes to organizing the community, the ideas, and this now goes back to how some mashaykh or imams and others are teaching. There are alienating ideas, and this is why sometimes the professional community, they come and they make sure they control, because sometimes the professional community is more diplomatic with different groups and different people because they want the organization to move forward. Whereas an imam may come in with a rigid mindset, and rigid mindset meaning that it's my way or the highway. That's what we're not necessarily pointing out one religious practice over another, but it's the attitude of it's my way or the highway, right? And so not only is it my way or the highway, but it's the idea also of demonizing the other. So these two concepts come in, and so then you begin to have problems with religious discourse, because there's sectarianism, or there is a way of looking at religious practice which is very suffocating, which is not Islam, right? When we look at the deen, so there's a certain mindset that is contained by the professional community because it has an issue. So the imam is left to being just the prayer leader and giving the khutbah, and the khutbah is even controlled to a certain extent because of the reality that is being faced. The other issue that comes in, like we mentioned, is the issue of organizing. So when we have a religious discourse that is not considering the reality of the ummah and the reality of where the people are at and the necessity of community and so on and so forth, and there is no leadership in reality, it's very hard to organize. So as we blame the imams, think about just the reality of what happens with Eid. A lot of what happens with Eid celebrations, and we're about to come to Eid al-Adha, a lot of what comes back to the issues that surround Eid celebrations has a lot to do with the board. Not all of that has to do with the imam, right? The boards, many times, they do not make it part of their agenda to unite with other masajid for whatever reason. For whatever reason, sometimes it's Eid al-Fitr money. Sometimes there's issues of worrying about power, whatever the reason that's there, but it hurts us at the organizational level, right? Because we're never seeing the Muslims organize except in conferences that, are high tag conferences, the price tag. And outside of that, maybe a protest. But, Eid celebration, and in some places they have transcended this problem. Some places the Muslims are in established, and you find that they're organizing. And that helps a lot, especially on the political front, right? Especially on the political front, because when you show that you can organize your community, it shows that you have some power. So again, the leadership crisis is much more than just blaming the imam. There's issues that come into that. The people that are on the board themselves, many of them require of the imam more than what they get, from the angle that they're not even in a position to lead the masjid many times. They think that their position at Cisco or the hospital or whatever it may be, the engineering firm, or in their small business, is enough to lead the community. It automatically gives them ranking, and it doesn't. And we don't require training of these people. We don't require certain basics of these people, right? And so you have board members that they look at the masjid as a status privilege thing. Of course, it's secondary to their job, but that mindset is there, right? That mindset is there, that they're not prepared. And so because they're not prepared, a lot of times, a lot of masajid, the visions that are there for those 501c3s on which the masjid is built is not a vision which is going to allow for the community to really be organized at a higher level. You have some, every now and then, some board members may be visionary in how it is that they conceive of community. And then after they die out, that kind of goes out the door. You have a lot of young people come in some areas. What I mean by young people, they're like in their 40s and their 30s, and they start coming into the board, and they're regurgitating some of the same problems that were there with the older generation, older than them. And they're influenced by whatever trend comes. And so they're controlling the masjid in that way. So there has to be a training in reality for board members on how do you run a community, because that's affecting our ability to organize ourselves at other levels, to even understand how to use resources, financial resources that come across our way, how to build assets. The vision is not really there, how to navigate, how to plan for the future, right? And so that's a big, big, big set of issues, and it needs a lot of discussions. And then part of organizing the community, it is also the issue of taking education serious. So because education is not taken serious from the angle even of how we deal with the Imam, and how the Imam is trained to deal with the community, right? The Imam is trained to deal with the community in a very limiting way. So the Imam is not developing himself, right? The Imam should be given that space and that time to develop self. Why? Because education is important on multiple levels. And so that Imam should be free enough to be able to continue to develop in so many different ways, so that we can focus on education. But that's not the priority among the professionals, right? You have board members, and I've experienced this myself. You have board members which will control the masjid, and they want to control the khutbah and tell you how to give the khutbah, and criticize your khutbah without being able to really tell you how they benefited from the khutbah. And they want to keep the discourse at a certain level. So we have issues when it comes to that, the vision of the community, the organization of the community, the priorities of the community, the leadership in the community, and then the role of education. And it has an impact because the literacy level of the people is questionable. Then what comes to play is the role of the converts and the youth, which they're in the almost same ranking, because they're in the process of developing a foundation for their deen. But to be honest with you, the born Muslim may be in the same situation, because it's not necessarily the case that a person that was born Muslim has an understanding of Islam. That is a misunderstanding that people have. And so raising the standard of the community needs or necessitates rethinking the relationship between the Imam and the board. And the reason why I mentioned this is because a lot of times people are blaming the Imams for a lack of leadership, when the Imams are not the leaders in the community for the most part. Some people, they imagine the Imam to be like an Imam Siraj, or how Imam Siraj or Wahaj was in the past, or an Imam Jamil Alameen. Those Imams are far and few in between. Imam Talib Abdul Rashid, Imam Mutaw Shaheed. These types of old school Imams, where they have a lead in the community in a way that is the dream of many Imams today to have, right? That's not the case. As we mentioned, a majority of our masajid, they're board run, they're run by professionals, right? And the professionals confuse operations for actual leadership in the community. They confuse management for leadership in the community. And they believe that a lot of us that do da'wah in our imams, we're stupid. That's the concept that is there. And so in the Arabic speaking community, the imam has to flex a little more because that's a known issue, right? So the imam has to develop himself a little more. And in the Desi community, you find that the understanding of the Maulana is a colonial understanding. So if we consider the imams to be weak and we consider them to be part of the problem, so then what are we doing to aid the imams to develop and grow? And as I mentioned, I want to close with this. I mentioned this in the past in other forums outside of this type of forum. I mentioned it actually in the khutbah, that if we continue like this, instability in imams' contracts, no health insurance, pay can be problematic, then expect that the youth are not going to want to be imams. So expect that we're going to have a crisis of leadership in that regard. So the other issue that comes in that and you have this in some masajid are on this model that anybody just is the imam. Anybody just comes in and does the khutbah. Anybody just comes in, and kind of leads the community. Leading salah is an important reality, but it's quite different than shaping the community as a whole. You can have someone lead salah, but when you start talking about someone that's actually educating in the community and guiding the community and thinking about the community growth, that's where the boards, they don't want the imam to have that role. They want to have that role. And look at the state of our communities, where how much money is wasted on furnishings and fixtures in the masjid building. And still, one masjid, I remember some years back, they boasted of the masjid being something like a $5 million project. And so they were hiring for a youth director position. So when I asked, what's the salary for that? The salary was so low that it has to be for someone that is not married, someone that doesn't have much responsibility, a part-time job. You spend $5 million on a building, but when it comes to build the youth themselves, you don't even want to give $40,000 as a salary per year, but you will spend $5 million on a building. See what I'm saying? That's not going to have a direct impact on your children if there's no one to really deal with them. And that problem repeats itself over and over again. That's why you have people that they don't know how to make salah. You have marital problems that are unlimited because there's no real program to guide the people into marriage. You see what I'm saying? Then on top of that, you have so many people competing with the imam for the role. So now you have the professional counselors that come in and they have their businesses established and they build their billable hours. So they want to undermine the imam's role. Say, no, we'll take the counseling. See what I'm saying? We'll take the counseling. Then you have organizations that come in and they're like, no, we'll do the education. So the masjid itself becomes a spot or a place that is impacted by competing interests. Whereas the masjid should be a place where the imam is well prepared, well grounded, and the imam is the one that creates that culture of education and guides the community. Without that, there's no communities that function like this. You can't find communities that function like this, like this idea of nobody leads and everything is controlled, right? And so it's controlled, and then there's no one that is accountable, right? That no one is accountable for the problems that exist. And so the reality of the situation is that the imams are being blamed for too much. That's the point. The imams really don't have their role, and because we're confused on the issue of who actually is leading the community, there's no one to go to. Now look at, and I definitely want to close on this point, look at how it is that imams and mashaykh and others have become influencers. Why? Because it gives them the space to breathe. They're able to be a little more productive without the politics. They're able, if they get to a certain point, to generate income. And on top of that, the new move of the organizations has been that they're moving away from imams doing fundraising and so on and so forth, because they're looking at the influencers. So once again, the same people that created these problems are the same people that are perpetuating these problems. I put it right back on the professional Muslim community that has discovered that it has a voice, that it has some money, that it has some education, that it has some ability to do, and they don't know what to do with it. And because you have so much of a fixation on controlling the masjid, we don't have any real powerful institutions. So on the political front, there's no power. The Muslims didn't build any hospitals. The Muslims didn't build any development corporations at a large scale. Not to say that some of these things don't exist, or that you have a cooperative style bank, right? That you have alternatives, right? That you have alternatives to the banking system. That you have networks for business development. That you have preparation. That you even have corporations, even, right, in a capitalist society, you know, at a high level of competition, right? So we encounter a lot of issues that we are not growing, in part because we're fixating on controlling the masjid. We're fixating on controlling the masjid, and in reality, there's no power, right? Because the power has not been generated properly. But at election times, our community members, they want to bring in the politicians and so on and so forth. But in reality, what is it that you have to show for it? Because the internal state of your community is not one that is organized, right? It's not one in which there's real leadership. You have, people can see it, you have some masajid wherein the non-Muslims are attending and they say, yes, I see that this masjid, and I'm telling you real life, has a lot of events, but I never see a leader here. There's no imam here. So we don't know who we're dealing with. The non-Muslims have said that to the Muslims with regard to the state and the situation. We don't know who we're dealing with. Who are we talking to? Because 1 minute is brother so-and-so, the next minute is brother so-and-so. You know, who is it that we're talking? When we go to the church, when we go to the synagogue, we know who the leader is there. And I can go on the problems that surround the weakness of the imams, but I want to keep to the point of closing this out. This is for people to think through things. It doesn't bother me if people have criticisms or they don't agree. The idea is for people to think more strategically on how can we better the community, and to really think about the problems that are associated with not really taking this stuff serious, right? We're not taking ourselves seriously in the right way, and we're taking ourselves seriously in the wrong way because of our degrees or what we have and this and that. And the work that's necessary to be in place is not in place at a scale that's impactful. Allah knows the best. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.